Joining me on this episode of the Neil Wilkins podcast, I'm delighted to welcome Matthieu Mehuys because Matthieu is somebody who is, well, he's an award-winning author. He's a passionate landscape architect who has lived and breathed gardening and landscape architecture all of his life. And we're going to go into that backstory as we get into this conversation. But really importantly, and this is something that is going to be relevant to each and every one of us, Matthieu has something that can really bring out this whole idea of being able to be sustainable at a personal level. So rather than waiting for politicians, rather than waiting for your boss, rather than waiting for your community to take the steps into sustainable action, Matthieu's got a lot of fascinating ideas and things he can share with us that allows us to take ownership of sustainability at the level of our garden. So I'm really, really excited to get into this conversation. Matthieu, welcome.
Hey Neil, I'm super excited to be on your show. Thank you very much for having me, and also very excited to dive into the topics you already touched upon.
Yeah, I mean, gardens. I mean, a lot of us have them. We're very fortunate to have quite a nice size, very, very mature garden. And some people have
Nice.
small gardens, they have courtyards, they have allotments, they have, medium-sized gardens on estates and things like this. We've all got kind of access to some level of garden. Either it's a parent or we've got our own. It's an important part of living, isn't it, a garden?
Oh yeah, definitely. So I'm from the other side of the channel, as we discussed before. I'm from Belgium. You're in the UK. When I started my study as a landscape and garden architect, one of the first trips we did in our university is we went to the UK because the UK has such a brilliant, rich history of gardens, parks. It was actually an eye opener to me, even so that there's a specific style in landscape design which is called English landscape park that is brilliant in the sense that it makes properties or gardens look bigger than they are. It looks very natural, but each and every tree is planted in a specific way, in a specific direction to make everything look bigger. So yeah, I think a lot of my work also started in the UK. So excited to be here. So I'll actually start by saying my backstory here because that helps your audience, people listening, to understand where everything started off for me. So I grew up on a family farm here in Belgium. My father is a farmer, my brother is a farmer, and from a super early age, it's actually one of my earliest memories that I have growing up on the farm, going with my father onto the fields, was my fascination of how on earth is it possible that if you have a tiny little seed and you put it in contact with the earth, that it can grow into a magnificent plant, or it can give you something to eat, or in some cases even grow into a massive, huge oak tree that is, especially in the UK, sometimes over 1,000 or even several thousand years old. That was just mind-boggling for me. So that actually gave the direction of the rest of my life, because then when I was about 5 years old, I told my parents I want to start gardening. I want to grow my own food because I just like it's so fascinating. So I started out with radishes, and everybody who wants to get into vegetable growing, start out with radishes. It's the easiest thing. It's an early success. You can hardly fail growing radishes. So for some reason, I started with radishes as well. And a couple of weeks later, I had radishes to share with my mother, and we had it for a salad. And I was just like, wow, it's so amazing. So then I thought, oh, this is super easy. I'll go and continue. Uh, like I got a little piece of the garden at the back somewhere hidden from my mother or from my parents. And then I started, okay, I'm going to prepare the soil, put in some compost. My grandmother came out even to help me because our soil is super hard clay soil. So it's like when it dries out, it's a brick. So we had to improve it. And then I just started putting all kinds of seeds everywhere, thinking like, just spread out some tomatoes here, lettuce there, everything like nicely organized. Also at that time, I got fascinated about like putting tiles in the garden, making like a shape, kind of starting to design a garden. That was where that love started. But then I think you already know what happens. Like I spread the seeds everywhere, thinking like I come back in a couple of weeks, will be full of big lettuce, big tomatoes. But it was just completely overgrown by weeds. And I was like, wow, what is this? I was devastated. Like, how is this possible? And then for probably the next 10 to 20 years, I tried to understand how is this possible. Like obviously I went into adolescence, I didn't really bother too much about it, but then later in life I got to understand what it actually means when you prepare the soil or you leave the soil bare and you do something or nothing. Weeds are always going to come. Like it's kind of like in gardening and landscape architecture. I loved about it with my social media manager, and we might create some content around it. Like saying weeds in gardening is as if you're saying Voldemort in Harry Potter. Nobody wants to talk about it. It's a no go. But actually, it's super important to talk about weeds because weeds can give you a lot of information, and there's also ways to mitigate them that are completely sustainable. Because if we go to the chemical solution of killing weeds, then you're actually going to make the problem worse because you're killing the soil. And if the soil is killed, always weeds will come back and more nasty weeds will actually come. So it's important to do that. And in a nutshell, that's where everything started. Obviously, along the lines, I also studied landscape architecture here in Belgium. I went on to do a master degree in Munich in Germany because the Germans were very good at the, the systematic way of doing things. So I learned a lot about the engineering part of gardens, especially for bigger projects. And then I found myself in a 9 to 5 job in Germany that I was super excited to start, and I learned a lot, and I'm actually very grateful for it. But after some time, I kind of got depressed in the 9 to 5 system, also very bureaucratic system in Germany. Lots of paperwork to do, and it was fine. Like I said, I learned a lot, but then I quit my job, started as a freelancer, got like an online job, took my laptop, my backpack, and I traveled the whole world to actually see projects that are doing really good things in terms of sustainability, ecology. So I volunteered at a lot of farms. I went to eco resorts to really dive deep, like what's happening in the world in terms of people that are doing good things for the world. So from that experience, I learned a lot. I then went on to work in Saudi Arabia, where I helped to do pretty much the impossible thing, growing plants in extreme weather conditions. So we worked on public parks in what are called wadis. Wadis are like Grand Canyons. So there's more humidity on the bottom. So we were designing parks there, working a lot with water and reusing water, like being very efficient with water. And then COVID hit. I had to leave the country, or I was stuck for there for a while because they closed the borders. But then I came home and I said, okay, I'm now going to start my own business because I have so many ideas and I know how to do it. And yeah, that's where my company Paulonia Landscape Architect was then born. And that was an approach where I help people, landowners, people who have even a small backyard, to do gardens that are both extremely beautiful, aesthetic, but then also it has a big focus on how can we actually do it that it's good for the environment, that it's good for the local biodiversity. Because then, as it even turns out, that's the beauty of this thing, is if or when you do a garden in such sense, it also drastically reduces the maintenance of your garden. So it's kind of, if you really dive deep into it, there's so many wins and so many ripple effects if you're doing it in the right way.
Wow. I mean, what a journey to bring you to this point. I mean, you really are following the love of the of the discipline. Really, it's it's so interesting to hear you sort of talking about the traveling of the world with regard to this, because the diversity of diversity really must have hit you hard. Were there any? Saudi Arabia is obviously a very interesting example, because of obviously the climate there is absolutely extreme
Yes.
in certain parts of the country. Were there any other kind of particular highlights for you in your travels of areas where people were doing things differently to maybe the rest of us?
Oh yeah, there was a ton of somehow on the news we always get bad news, right? That's how the news works. We only get to see um, yeah, there's something about our human nature. We're drawn to bad news because bad news gets more views. That's just how things are. So we think like the whole world is pretty much a mess. But then there's so many people out there that are doing brilliant things. So I spend a lot of time in I first went to Bali, went to like a resort that they had built it over the last 30 years. They When they were developing the resort, they considered each and every plant that was already there. They built in the houses so they didn't have to cut down any trees, or if they did, they would like replant 10 new trees. uh, a whole water wastewater system, like how to reuse the water to make sure there's no runoff. like that was a really good experience. That it's called Blue Lagoon in Bali. And then I went on to go to Colombia. I was there on another eco resort that stood out because they were really also focusing on the local community, because you had indigenous people on that land, and they completely integrated that with the eco resort, and it became like part of also the total experience, where you go as a tourist. You're not just like sitting in a resort looking at a swimming pool, sitting there for a week and then going home. No, you got to like talk to the indigenous people. There was like ceremonies. They had a big farm where I was working to help to grow things as much for the kitchen. So at that time they were producing already 20% on the land, and they wanted to increase that over the years. I think they're probably over 50% now. So there's a ton of really good projects out there. And yeah, that was really inspiring for me. Then I think the biggest thing that actually stood out for me was when I went to the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador. And I'll tell you a funny story, because what happened is that when I went to the Amazon rainforest, I got dengue. So dengue is like pretty much like malaria, and it put a stop at my whole travel. And I think in retrospect, obviously, you can only connect the dots looking backwards, is what Steve Jobs said. Is that I think that Mother Nature said like, okay, you've traveled enough, you've seen this, I'm also big on surfing. Like I would find spots in the world where you can also do good surfing. So I think Mother Nature was like, hey, you've seen enough. You like it's time for you to go back home and actually do something with this. So I still remember, though, it was like a 5 days in the depth of the Amazon rainforest, and I had a guide who you couldn't find anywhere online. He only had it was only through referrals, but he had worked with National Geographic because he was also in an indigenous, but he could speak Spanish. And he was so fascinating because he first of all, he knew each and every animal and plant in the rainforest, but he could also imitate the sounds, so he could kind of communicate with the animals, so that if he saw them, they would kind of stay. I don't know, he was building like a trust with them. So we saw so many animals in 5 days, like dolphins in the water, different 10 different monkeys, parrots, toucans, like so many diversity. And then the trees, you cannot imagine how big the trees are. The size, the diameter of a tree is like the size of a house, and then it goes high. You can't even see how high it goes. It's like it had such a profound impact on me And again, in retrospect, thinking like, okay, this is such a pristine and important ecosystem for the health of our planet. In our personal, let's say, modern world, we have to do as much as possible to prevent that we have to exploit those landscapes. So the more we can grow our own food on our own property, the less pressure we are putting on agriculture, the more we can do things without killing our local environment, the better it will be for the whole health of our planet. So we're actually, and that's what I want to get at, like each and every person who starts gardening, even if you only have a small backyard, you're having a huge impact on the environment, because there's a something called the butterfly effect, where they say the the wing of a butterfly can start a hurricane. So yeah, that was the whole rainforest was a really profound, well, something that completely stood out in that whole journey.
Yeah, and the thing I'm picking up from you, Matteo, is this idea, I guess, of, with all of those, various locations, and you are so fortunate. They are the traveling of those places with surfing too. So it was kind of a
Pre-COVID.
win-win. And pre-COVID, it was very different. Yes, it was absolutely. But it's the local piece, isn't it? You've used the word indigenous a few times. You've said local here quite often. And for me, I think this is one of the key themes I think that's coming through here, is that I think a lot of people shy away from feeling that they can make a difference because they think, oh, it's just too big, or if I'm only doing my thing, it's not going to make enough of an impact, it's not going to be
Yes.
big enough. Whereas actually all of these projects that you're talking about here, they are resorts, they are self-contained, almost little islands in themselves. And that's what we have with our own gardens, isn't it? It is that we've got this space on the planet, and it might be very, very small, or it might be, if you're fortunate, a little bit bigger. It almost doesn't really matter, but it's a space that we can have control of, apart from the weeds. I
Mhm.
want to come to the weeds in a minute, because that's
We'll
something that
talk about that.
I'm challenged with as well. But it's a really interesting kind of idea, isn't it, to begin small, begin local, begin with the things that you can control. Is that what you're seeing, that people are now starting to understand and pick up, this fact that you have control to some extent over the space, the garden, the backyard that you have?
Oh yeah, definitely. So something that stood out when you were talking is now two quotes, two things that people can take home is like, we have to think global but act local. That's a big one. It's kind of like, we're seeing all of these global problems, and we're looking to like politicians to resolve it for us, but they're looking at each other like, what are we doing here? And then there's all the craziness of politics that I don't even want to get into. It's not working. Like, we have to take our own responsibility and do as much locally. And I can give you some beautiful examples from, I'm actually teaching people how to design, create, and maintain their own garden. And some of my students have now become landscape architects themselves. Like, they showed what they learned and did for their own garden to friends and family, and they're like, wow, this is amazing, can you do it for me? So we can talk about that later. But the other quote that I think is important, that you already mentioned in a way, is we have to think big, start small, and move fast. So these are all things that we can do. Everybody can think big, like dream, like, oh, what do you want your garden to look like? You want to make it into a heaven on earth, a garden of Eden, something exceptional. That's the big thing. Think as big as you can. Like, there's no limit to thinking big. And then you have to start. So you start small with a square meter of your garden, or with starting a complete redesign of your garden. And then once you've like started small, you can then also move fast, because you're getting experience, and you're like, oh, now it's becoming easier. So you can do a lot of great things. So yeah, I think that's really important in that conversation. And then the other thing that I want to mention is that there's research out there that they've like tried to understand, like, what are the most important ecosystems of our planet. And by ecosystems, it's not just something that is beautiful or biodiverse. It actually has a ripple effect on our personal health. It's something with what they call ecosystem services, something that we'll be starting to hear more and more, even in politics, which is a great thing, that the ecosystem services give us clean water, clean air, all kinds of things that it's very hard to monetize or to put into numbers. Some people are actually doing it. I read an article in the Netherlands that a government decided to buy like a 5 million property, and they did a whole financial breakdown that it would actually reduce the tax payment of that municipality because people would start to become healthier, more access to greenery, so lower health bills and lower tax expenditures because they're creating healthier people. That was really beautiful to see that. But just to go back to the story of like each and everyone who has a small backyard, the research showed that there's 2 areas on our planet that are extremely valuable. The first one, obviously, is the pristine landscapes, the rainforest in the Amazon, our ancient forests even in the UK, even in Europe, there's still a couple ones left. And the second one is the periphery of cities, so the suburbs of cities, where everybody has like a little garden, everybody's growing different plants, different flowers, like everybody's kind of mixing things up. These are also seen as the most important ecosystems on our planet. So there's even a lot of nature reserves that are less valuable in terms of ecosystem services than the surrounding of cities. So I thought that is brilliant, and it actually empowers people to be like, oh yeah, wait a minute, if I can grow some different plants in my garden, do it in a way that's sustainable, that is even low in maintenance, we can talk about the weeds, and then it will actually improve my personal life directly, because there's also other research that shows that, I mean, we all came from nature. We kind of got separated from nature because of urbanization, industrialization, but we only a couple thousand years ago we were completely living in nature, so it has an important impact on us. Even like I heard another story that the singing of birds, when you're sitting in your garden and you can create a garden that attracts a lot of bird life, you'll be sitting in your garden enjoying the sounds of the birds. And they actually figured out that why we as humans intrinsically love this sound is that when we were still living in the complete wilderness, whenever you would be like relaxing as a hunter-gatherer and you would hear the sound of birds, it was a sign of safety, because it would mean that there were no predators around. At the moment the birds that were singing stopped singing because there's maybe a lion coming out of the bush, you knew like, oh, something's wrong. So that's why we still love these sounds so much. Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? I had not heard that story before, but when you think about it, it feels so natural. It's so obviously correct, isn't it? Because as a human, you think, yeah, absolutely, I get that. No, that's really interesting. Matteo, there's so much we can talk about here, aren't there? So many threads of, ideas and of flow and of things that we can possibly do here. I mean, one of the interesting things, I wanted to come back to a word again that I said earlier that you've used a lot, is this word indigenous, because it seems to me that for a lot of us, and I guess we do this with our choice of food from the supermarket as well, we have access to produce and plants and things from all over the planet. Now, obviously, all those things have a carbon impact, and there's, sustainability issues with shipping a lot of these things to us. But taking that aside, because we're not really talking about that in this conversation, but Is it a healthy thing? You talk about the periphery of big cities where, small people with smaller gardens in the suburbs are kind of creating gardens, and they're bringing a whole host of different sort of plants and things into those gardens. That versus something where a garden is more established, but with indigenous plants that are obviously very local to that region or that area. Is there a one is better than the other, or is it just no, just plant things because everything is good?
Oh, I love this question, and I might give you a bit of a con- controversy answer. In if we There's a lot of advocacy around only using indigenous plants, and it kind of makes sense. But if we look at it, it's kind of racist. Like, even as to humans, we're not saying if you come from another area of the world, hey, you're not indigenous, you can't be here. It's it's That's the kind of notion. But there's one important thing that we do have to consider when there's certain invasive species, and we know which plants are extremely invasive. These we do have to be very careful to use them. That's an important thing. But other than that, I think we should plant as many different plants from all over the world, because there's several reasons for it. First of all, is climate change. The plants that were growing very well in our temperate climate here in the UK and in Belgium no longer function that well. Like, we have indigenous plants that they just don't, they like temperate climates, which is like not too hot, not too cold, good water, not too dry, not too wet. And now we're seeing all these extreme weather patterns. These plants are under a lot of stress. Some die because our climate is changing. We can't avoid it. So that's another reason to also start integrating plants from other areas of the world that are resilient. Obviously, again, making sure that they're not invasive. But even sometimes an invasive plant can be very useful, because an invasive plant will do a lot of photosynthesis, which then again creates sequesters a lot of carbon dioxide. So we have to be a little bit careful in this discussion. But I'm not an opponent of saying like everything should be indigenous. It doesn't make any sense. Even so, it was something that, and again, it's a bit of a controversy, but this was something that Hitler was putting out there. He was a big fan of only using indigenous plants, and he did a lot of that work, getting rid of plants that were not part of the European climate. So I think we have to be careful by saying that. Yeah, I think we're living on a global planet. Everything is mixed, so why not use the diversity in our gardens as well?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It was a leading question, actually, from a very personal perspective. I mean, my wife Sonia and I, are very fortunate that we've moved into this house again around sort of COVID time. So we've been here about 4 years now, and very fortunate. So the house is coming up to 100 years old. The garden is obviously of an equal age. So we've got some
Wow.
very well established plants and trees in the garden. Really fortunate. And we don't know quite how and when, but over the years, clearly some people have been traveling, because we have Japanese hinoki tree. We've got an ancient kind of medlar tree. We've got a California pine. We've got ginkgo trees, things that you just don't see in a traditional kind of English garden, which tends to be small bushes, small shrubs and herbs maybe. So we're really fortunate to have a very diverse range of plants. And so I wanted to kind of just test out, was that a good thing? So whoever was before us, I love gardens, but I'm not a great gardener. I'm a good gardener, but I'm not a great gardener. So it's really nice to know that the people who've gone before us, who've created this space, they were actually doing a good thing, almost sort of conceiving that at some point this was going to be important, maybe. So there is a thing of beauty here, but balanced with balance, I guess, with plants from varying sort of places. But we also have a beach, quite a long beach hedge. Now the beach in the UK is suffering, and has been for quite some years. Obviously the increase in temperatures, and a lot of research that we've seen is that the beach sort of trees and bushes will be moving or migrating northward as the ones in the south, it just becomes too hot for them. We're not seeing that yet, but I'm just really conscious that things are constantly changing and moving. Are you seeing in your work, are you seeing certain plants and certain things become, more relevant now that we are sort of seeing more extreme weather, for example?
Oh yeah, totally. Like you said, the beach is under a lot of pressure. Certain plants that we used to, like, I'm only in the industry for like 10 years, but if I listen to people or nurseries that we work with, like they had a lot more different plants. It's kind of narrowing down again, but I'm also hopeful that it will open up again to more plants that can handle the extreme weather patterns, because you just have to look at historically at other areas of the world, and then there you can actually use a lot of the plants. Yeah, and I think it's brilliant what you mentioned for your personal garden. It's actually already in the 1800s. It was actually a thing to collect as many different plants from the whole world and kind of showcase them in your garden. It's kind of a prestige thing. This is the times where the first zoos uh, were out there, where you would show exotic animals. Same thing with plants. So I think it's definitely historic, especially in the UK as well. So people have been doing that for a while, trying to look at what plants can grow. And also there's so many climates across the world that have similar conditions. Like a brilliant example is the south of South Africa, close to Cape Town, which is kind of a Mediterranean climate, but it also has quite some. If you go to the mountains, like there's an area called Drakensberg, which means like Dragon's Mountain, and it's a little bit higher. So there's a huge diversity of plants that only grow in that specific area. And a lot of the garden plants that we have today came from there, because they would work very well in our climate, and uh, they're producing a lot of different flowers. Like even now, if I look at it at this time of the year, if I look into a nature reserve, there's not much flowering or pollinating things going on. It's like this in between season in August now for the listeners. And in your garden, you can still have a lot of different flowers. So the bees and the insects can come now more to your garden before they go back to the nature reserve. So I think that's important in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, did want to come on to the impact on wildlife for creating a garden that kind of obviously looks amazing. It's a beautiful space for a human to be in, but also it's a really creative space for insects and bees. It's a fascinating one for me, this one, because this is something when we moved in, we realized that the garden was very much a springtime garden. So the flowers that appear in the spring, it becomes multicolored. I mean, it really does. There are so many different sort of species of plants and flowers that we've got. And then this time of the year, we're back to just green again. Well, it's quite dry green, but it's green. So all the flowers are gone. We're in a completely different phase. And so what we decided to do was plant a lot of flowers that would be summer blooming for the bees and for the butterflies. And the first 3 years, yeah, they came. This year, really interestingly, we've hardly seen any. There were a few butterflies this week, but the bees, where are they? They've gone. And my mother as well, who's again got a really established garden, and she has this signature apple tree. And she said the blooms, the apple blossom in the spring was incredible, but there were no bees to pollinate it. She hasn't got a single apple on this tree. And we're just thinking, what is happening over one season? It feels like it's very, very different, and it's really concerning. But I just wanted to come back to the whole kind of planting for wildlife as well as planting for humans. Any kind of advice and guidance as to where somebody might even begin? Because we were making it up as we were purchasing these flowers and these bushes. We didn't really understand what we were purchasing, but it was just on the label. It said good for bees, good for insects. So we
Yeah.
bought it. But is there more of a science that people can follow?
Yeah, definitely. There's certain things that you have to do in your garden to enable more wildlife. So wildlife in and of itself can be birds, other animals, but obviously the whole insect world is part of that. And before answering how you can actually improve that, I want people to understand why it's so important. So obviously it's important just generally for nature, but if you don't even bother about that, I'll tell you it's super important for the maintenance and the health of your garden. So I see far too often, we've been in a couple of gardens where people like make their garden super clean. They they even use a lot of chemicals for to keep plants kind of alive and to get rid of plants they don't like. And then what happens is no insects are around, and then it's like a downward spiral of the health of your garden deteriorating. It's the same with our personal health. And in the other direction, if you can make a garden that is super biodiverse, that is inviting for wildlife, for insects, for everything, you're kind of imitating how nature works, and you're creating a flywheel of biodiversity that is going to keep your soil healthy. It's going to get your plants healthy. So if your plants are healthier, you'll have less problems with weeds. You'll see so many benefits that your garden becomes more in harmony with nature. And this, by the way, is it's the topic of my book, 12 Universal Laws of Nature, how to get the most potential out of your land, where I clearly describe, like, okay, how does nature work? Excuse me. And how can we tap into that to make our garden lower in maintenance? And it's brilliant to see how the effect is on that. So that's why I want people to understand why it's important. Now, a couple of things that people can do directly after listening to this episode is that you have to keep your soil covered as much as possible. Like, and again, I'll explain something which is called the succession of plants. Like, if we look into nature, where do you ever see soil that is bare? Like, where the soil is empty. It hardly happens. Only after a landslide or after a wildfire. But even at a wildfire, there's some ashes laying covering the soil. So it hardly happens, but it does happen. And then what does nature want to do when there is bare soil? Nature is always trying to restore itself. That's what nature is like. It's nature wants to restore itself all of the time. So as it turns out, when you make your soil bare, the first plant that nature will send out to start the regeneration of the health of the soil, because if you make a soil bare, it's like killing your own skin. Like the, the topsoil of our planet is like our own skin. If you open it, you're kind of destroying it. So nature is like, oh, okay, let's resolve this. Let's send out all the weeds, because the weeds are annual plants that each and every weed comes for a specific reason. Just to give you an example, a dandelion, we know it. It's some people find it very difficult to handle when it's in your garden beds. It's not nice. But what it actually does, or what it also indicates, is that when you have dandelions in your garden, it means your soil is compacted, and that there is a lack of certain minerals and nutrients in the topsoil. So that's the indication, because what a dandelion does, it has a super deep taproot. It can go up to 5 meters in the depth of the soil and find minerals somewhere and bring it up to the surface, and then through the leaves that will decompose every year because it dies off in winter, it will start to add all the minerals in the topsoil so that the soil is regenerating. So and also the deep taproot breaks open and decompacts the soil. So that's the indication. Now, when you want to get rid of dandelions, because it's not a fun thing, you can either be like, okay, I'll leave that area full of dandelions for a couple of years. The nature is going to take care of it. Then the soil will be decompacted, and I can add different plants. Or you can actively do something about it. And first of all, when you get out the dandelion, leave the when you cut it off, leave the leaves of the dandelion in that exact area, because the leaves are full of the minerals. Then what you can do as well is decompact the soil. There's something called like a garden fork, or we call it a Grelly net. It's a brand here in Belgium that has like the best tool ever. So it puts like a lot of pins into the soil and then lifts it up and decompacts it. And it's really important to do that rather than turning the soil completely around, because if you turn it around, you're destroying it even more. So also another thing is like, don't try to mix your soil. Sometimes you have to if you're doing like vegetables or annuals, but try and avoid that as much as possible. Is a big one. Uh, and then like keeping the soil covered. So what you would then do is also add a little bit of super high quality compost. And if you don't have your own compost in your garden, I'd recommend for you to go to regenerative or organic farmers that are doing compost, because they know how important it is for the health of their system. So you can buy it from them. Then you spray it. Even you don't have to do like a big layer, because the high quality compost is full of microorganisms, good minerals. Like, you don't even have to put that much. And then you can plant whatever you like, every new plants that you want to like see established in your garden. And then, super important thing, use mulch. Like, if you best thing is to have plants that cover the soil, but obviously when you're starting out a new garden, it's difficult to do that. So you're bringing a good quality mulch. Even on our family farm, we started to experiment with different types of mulch, because straw did have some effect, but it would also attract a lot of slugs. So we tried something else with actually the straw of beans, because on our farm we're producing some kidney beans, and the straw of it is like the best garden mulch ever. So I started to experiment with that a couple of years ago. Now we did a garden project here in Belgium, a new one for a new client. And I said, like, okay, we're gonna do everything to make it awesome for biodiversity, for soil health. So we did everything, and that garden, we've like planted the last plants in April. It's now August. The contractor that we work with had only had to do one round of maintenance, 3 guys, 4 hours, and it's like a 5,000 square meter garden, because the mulch is like stopping or blocking the weeds from growing. So it's amazing. Whereas like this also saved the client like probably over 2,000 euros in maintenance. And they love to do it themselves, because you just walk through your garden, you see a little weed, you pull it out. And also, again, don't like pull it out and put it away, because the thing with the weeds is like, if you pull it out and you put it away, that weed has the minerals that the soil needs. So pull it out and keep it, like, obviously try and get the soil off, otherwise it will regrow. But just leave it on top of the mulch, and then it will decompose and it will add nutrients to your soil, so that the plants that you do want to be growing will perform better. And then it's like again, you're doing a flywheel of how nature actually works, and you use that knowledge to your advantage to become a gardener that can actually enjoy his garden and not have a broken back of weeding all the time.
I think you've just saved me a few hours every week here, then, Matteo, because yeah, I had no idea about that bare earth, the bare soil thing, and we have only a few areas in the garden that are like that, and of course, yes, up come the weeds. It's very interesting, and certainly with the dandelions as well. That is probably why dandelions. If you put a dandelion in your salad when you're making salad for lunch or for dinner, why they're so strong, because they are containing all those minerals, I guess. Because it's allegedly they're
Oh,
very,
yeah,
very nutritious, and that's probably the reason why
exactly.
they've taken all the energy and the goodness from your soil and they've given it to you in your salad. But yes, if you don't put them back, that's not good news.
Neil,
What is
I'll
your
tell you I'll tell you one other thing. Like, the analogy of our personal health and the health of our soil, it's mind-boggling. Like, I've started to get into that because I'm also working with farmers, and soil health is like the number one most important thing. I'll tell you this: plants, the roots of plants are like are like our own stomach, but just inside out. So the way that plants absorb nutrients from the soil is through an interaction with microorganisms. So again, it's super important not to use chemicals in your garden. Only organic things or things that actually improve the health of the soil. It's definitely, I recommend using that, but no like toxic chemicals, because otherwise you're killing the microorganisms. And how it actually works is that the microorganisms take certain minerals, they change the composition slightly so that the plants can absorb them way better. And in exchange, the plants give the microorganisms sugar. So it's like a beautiful symbiosis between the microorganisms giving the plants the nutrients, and in exchange, they get sugar because the plant is performing photosynthesis, so it has excess sugar. So it gives that, and it's beautiful. And I'll tell you this, I told you like the roots are the same as our stomach inside out. So also in our personal gut health, we are full of microorganisms, and those microorganisms in our gut are very often the same as in the soil, often similar because it's more anaerobic, so there's less oxygen than in the soil, but still they're very alike. Now, if you have a gut or you're eating food that is full of chemicals, you're killing your own gut. And this is like proven to be linked to all of the modern diseases, cancer, diabetes. All of the modern diseases are linked to the gut health and even the brain health. Even so, that mental illnesses are now like seen that there's a link to that, all the like modern mental illnesses that were not really here 100 200 years ago, or not in such a big like quantity. There's so many people struggling physically and mentally, that this is also in our brain is full of beneficial microorganisms. So it's super important both for the health of your garden and the health of your soil, but also for your personal health. Because then if you like walk through your own garden and you're doing everything to enhance the soil, to enhance the plants, you walk barefoot through that garden, you touch the plants, you're absorbing all those good things, and it's going to have a direct impact on your personal life. Yeah.
So it's good for everyone and everything, which is so good. You know, this is real best practice, isn't it? Because it's so easy to do this stuff, but so few of us, I guess, have that knowledge and information to be able to play with. But as soon as somebody like you, Matteo, actually tells us, it's like, oh well, yeah, it's so obvious. And it's like, why didn't I know that? Why didn't somebody teach me this? And I was going to ask you the question about grass lawns, because we're seeing a lot of I guess promotion, to call it a word, on social media, for example, that you shouldn't be cutting your lawn because you need to leave the lawn to grow with all the natural kind of flowers and sort of things within the lawn will get a chance to express themselves. And again, great for the bees and for the insects and probably the life of the garden as well. But it comes to a certain point where that is just so high. The level of the grass is so high that you are never going to be able to get it back without some industrial intervention. So is there best practice for good lawn care?
Yeah, it's a big topic, and I agree to a certain extent. It's good to like what we call like don't mow in May. I don't know if there's a certain word in the UK, which is good, but still you don't want to be bothered by your functionality of your garden. Like if you're just gonna have a complete wilderness, it's not actually gonna be that diverse or biodiverse, because also in nature, like again, if we go to the pristine landscapes that are high in biodiversity, an extremely important aspect of that is grazers, animals that roam the land, they graze the grass, they are actually maintaining the landscape. Now, if you go into your own garden, you cannot have unless you can integrate a cow. I've even seen like people getting like these super small, cute cows to maintain their lawn. I'd love to get more into that, but for most people, it's very difficult to get a grazer, let alone that you would start grazing your grasslands. That's not possible. But so in that sense, I still think it's important to maintain your grassland. Obviously, if you can leave some areas to grow wilder, it's good, but we have to be careful. Like there's a whole new paradigm of people thinking like, oh, a sustainable garden is a garden that you don't touch. It's something you just, and same with nature reserves. We think like, oh, we're gonna put a fence around it, and then it's nature that will take care of it. No, it's not. It doesn't work like that, because again, our nature has evolved in a certain way for millions and millions of years. We've now, as a human species, had such a deep impact that it's oftentimes not possible for grazing animals to be in nature reserve. So we have to reintroduce them there. Now, for your personal garden, I still see it's important to mow your grass. But in that whole conversation around lawns, there's a bit of a craziness in lobbying as well, that the way our modern lawns, and this is like the contractors that I work with are doing it, the type of grass that they use is a grass that needs a lot of care and a lot of maintenance, and in fact a lot of chemicals to survive. So it's oftentimes one or two types of grass. So already there's not much biodiversity, or not much diversity, and that then means that the companies that sell the seeds, they also sell all the chemicals that come to keep the lawn looking green. You have to like add a lot of nitrogen, and it's not good for the groundwater. It's just a way for those companies to keep making money year after year after year. So we don't need any of that. You can just, even if you stop like doing all those chemicals in your lawn, over time it will become more green and diverse in and of itself. But I think if you're doing a new lawn, it's recommended to get a mix of different types of grasses. So then also the grass that can be performing well will grow the best, and you'll have the best results. Like even in our farm, we didn't. It was like we added a huge new garden. It used to be just a pasture for cow, and we just didn't change the lawn. Now over time, a lot of clover started to grow, and clover is amazing. If you have clover in your lawn, keep it. It's so good, because when you have a dry season, it's the only thing that actually still looks green, especially if you have a bit of a sandy soil. If you don't have too much clay in your soil, clover will always be green. And it's also good for the bees, the little flowers. So I think best practice in lawn is like, try and, if you're doing a new lawn, mix different types of seeds, try and get it as diverse as possible. If you have an existing lawn, stop using all the chemicals, maybe even like scratch the whole surface and add some other seeds. Also decompact it with the tool that I told you, that's really helpful. Add even again a little layer of high quality compost, and you'll see how fast it improves. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, Matteo, this has been just such a great conversation. I could talk to you on gardens and all your guidance and stuff all day. I mean, seriously, I could. But I'm just aware of obviously the time and your calendar and everything. If somebody wants to follow up with you, because we've only really scratched the surface of the top layer of soil with all the information that you have here. If they want to follow up, you're giving a free 30-minute one-to-one gardening training, aren't you? Which is absolutely an incredible offer for people who want to take this next step into a garden that might save the world. Where can they contact you?
So yeah, I'll give you the link to a Calendly, and it's a very smart system. You just click through it, and you can have a look into my calendar. And I've kept open a couple of spots, or in my busy schedule, I block it out so I can still get to talk with people, because I love the interaction and helping people directly. And in this 30 minutes, we'll dive deep in your specific garden and see what I can help you specifically with, and what is needed to become a good practice gardener and create your own heaven on earth.
Wonderful. I really applaud the work that you're doing, Matteo. I think it's so valuable. And I think, all of us really, and I would ask everybody listening to this episode, please do share, because I think the more people who become aware of Matteo and the work that he's doing, I think, the world needs, more people like this, just sharing the simple things that we can do locally to make a big impact globally. And I just love going back to that phrase because it is just so true. Matteo, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Neil, for having me. This was wonderful. You asked some really, really good questions. I have not had somebody who puts the questions so greatly. Thank you for that.